its own war effort and structure while dodging the increased activity of the Imperial fleet. Even in the prelude to Hoth, the Empire had managed to nice some notable defeats on the rebels that cost them supplies and firepower. The subsequent attack on Hoth was effectively a disaster for the Alliance. The Imperial ground offensive on the snow-covered planet and the blockade above its surface cost the rebels significant casualties and forced them to scatter across the stars before being able to regroup in many ways. Hoth was the worst day the Rebel Alliance suffered in the entire war. It was the day when their base and significant members of their leadership were destroyed, captured, or killed. But that isn't entirely what happened. The above version of events has been widely accepted, by myself included, as the clearest understanding of the Battle of Hoth from the Rebel Alliance's point of view. There have been some excellent works already created that focus on the Rebel Alliance at Hoth, the strength of the base's field generator, and ion cannon barrage managed to turn a catastrophic, potentially was ending, defeat into just a disastrous mount. However, the Rebel Alliance were not the only participants in that battle. The Empire was there top to date. Far less examination has been given to the Imperial experience of that battle or the impact it had on the Empire's wider war effort. This is something that I feel needs to be corrected, because when taking in some seemingly disparate aspects of evidence from within Imperial records, testimonies from soldiers and officers who were there, and also the wider reaction to Hoth beyond Death Squadron, some very interesting interpretations can begin to appear. The assumption has always been that the Empire, having achieved a decisive military success at Hoth, would have been pleased with the battle's outcome and its impact on disrupting the Rebel Alliance. But I am unsure if that was really the case. The evidence I will present in this chapter, and I acknowledge that this may be critiqued by my peers, suggests something very different. For I believe that the Battle of Hoth can actually be viewed as a defeat for the Galactic Empire, and one that took a heavy toll on Imperial morale across the galaxy. Rather than being the moment the Rebel Alliance nearly met its final defeat, it could, and perhaps should, also now be viewed as the point when many Imperials began to wonder not just if they could even win the war, but if they might well be in danger of losing it. Cutting the strings. While Darth Vader was almost solely committed to uncovering the Rebel base, the rest of the Imperial fleet, as organized by the Joint Chiefs, was given a degree of freedom to deal with the rest of the war effort. As long as they did not undertake actions that undermined Vader's or in any way challenge his authority, it appears that their new conquest commander was content to leave them to their own devices. Unexpectedly, this freedom to operate, which had not been granted to them by Tag, the Battle of Hoth and Imperial morale, or Tarkin before him, gave the Imperial fleet an early advantage. With full control of the search for the Rebel base assumed by Vader, the rest of the fleet could concentrate their efforts elsewhere. In the lead up to Hoth, the focus of the Joint Chiefs fell on the rebels' ability to supply and sustain their own military efforts. If these could be disrupted, then the rebellion might be defeated by weapon shortages and hunger. It was not the sort of destructive defining victory envisioned by Tarkin, but would leave the rebellion just as dead. Significant resources were therefore committed to discovering rebel shipyards and supply bases and denying them to the enemy. While the rebels had successfully stolen several Mon Calamari cruisers during the mutiny on Mon Cala, these alone would not be enough to directly engage the forces of the Galactic Empire. The rebels needed to modify them for combat, build more capital ships and fighters, and produce enough replacements and spare parts for the ones already in operation. That level of industrial output required rebel-controlled shipyards. So far, the Empire had not been able to locate them, but that was about to change. The defeat of the Death Star at Yavin had sparked various uprisings against Imperial rule. One of these had occurred on the mining world of Shutorun, and the ensuing civil conflict there had been won by the planet's ruler, Queen Trios. However, unbeknownst to the Rebel Alliance, with whom Queen Trios cultivated connections, the Empire had supported her claims to the throne and held her true allegiance. As Imperial activity increased across the Outer Rim in an attempt to find the rebels' manufacturing center, Trios transmitted information regarding the rebel shipyard at Makota to Darth Vader. Breaking off his hunt for the rebel base, Vader brought Death Squadron, including the Superstar Destroyer Executor, to the system and devastated the Alliance forces there. Half of the rebel cruisers present were destroyed, and around 90% of the fighters as well. Senior rebel commander Vanden Hike Willard was killed in the initial assault, and Leia Organa and Mon Mothma only escaped after General Jan Dodonna sacrificed his life and flagship to ensure their survival. With rebel production curtailed and a significant dent put into the rebel fleet, focus shifted to their supply lines. For some time, the rebels had been moving supplies through the Dara system on the Outer Rim. These convoys contained a variety of weapons, equipment, food, and medicines that were required for various rebel cells across the galaxy. More importantly, over 80% of the stockpiles were allocated to equipping the hidden rebel base. While the location itself remained a mystery, cutting off the Alliance's line of supply would significantly increase the Empire's chances of a wider strategic victory. Ironically, the action that destroyed a significant convoy near Dara IV and ambushed the vaunted renegade squadron of the Rebel Alliance was carried out by officers and forces who had been partially exiled from mainstream Imperial operations. It was Vice Admiral Ray Sloan, a figure of huge importance in the Empire's future, on board the Star Destroyer Vigilance, in cooperation with remnants of the 7th Fleet, who were able to establish the likeliest candidates for rebel shipping routes in the expansion region, and narrow the list down to Dara. Though the Rebel Alliance were not able to ascertain exactly what happened at Dara 4th, we know now that the Vigilance took the lead given it was Sloan's plan, but was ably supported by the Dark Omen and, most importantly, the interdictor cruiser retention that helped isolate the convoy and enabled its destruction. As far as the Imperial fleet were concerned, it was a near-perfect victory. Archives, Section, Military Operations, File, Assault. Makota Rebel Alliance Archives, Section, Makota Shipyards, File. Losses and Debriefing. 5 Imperial Archives, Section, Military Operations, File, Dara 4C8. What information recovered from the damaged computer core of the Vigilance. New Republic Archives, Section, Imperial Prisoners, File, Interrogations, and one achieved entirely from their own merits. Sloan had previously been demoted to Commodore before Yavin and was still working her way back up the rank hierarchy. This victory granted her a promotion to Fall Admiral and saw her and other Imperial leaders reincorporated back into the main fold of operations. It also granted her a place on the Joint Chiefs. Stripped of their manufacturing abilities and with their major supply line cut, the Rebel Alliance was already facing a disaster. It had been 3 years since Yavin, and they had not been able to significantly progress the war in their favor. With Vader hunting down their base, a point of reckoning was approaching. Assault on Hoth. The rebels' account of events at Hoth, their discovery of an Imperial probe droid moments before Vader's fleet arrived, is relatively well established. Safe from an orbital bombardment beneath their field generator, the rebels fought a holding action on the planet's icy surface, while evacuation transports attempted to break through the Imperial blockade, supported by ion cannon fire designed to disable the Star Destroyers above. Despite the best efforts of rebel pilots and soldiers, only 13 of the 30 transports launched from the surface survived to escape into hyperspace, and many hundreds of personnel were either killed on the surface, shot down, or captured. This overview gives a reasonably adequate account of the rebel experience of the battle at Hoth, what we know of the. But it is also instructive to now examine battle and to begin to assess the potential flaws or EE-Cal command duties from on board the Exeter Ossel has been Asabo, mighted military officer in the years since his death, and he certainly wasn't blessed with any great strategic abilities. But he Abo was not stupid either in military matters or in recognizing the precarity of his position as Darth Vader's chief underling. Mazel appears to have been present on the bridge of the Executor when Darth Vader used Grand General Tog. He therefore knew what working www.Kivivi could mean. While he failed at Hoth, Opal must have possessed some skills that made him useful enough to be kept alive that point, and to have reached the rank of admiral on a vessel as important as the WWTR. Orell's mistake at Hoth appears to have been one that was endemic within the Imperial fleet, particularly among those who placed great veil in the firepower of their ships. He believed that by dropping out of hyperspace directly into Hoth's orbit, that the rebels would be too surprised to adequately react. Having not foreseen that the rebels may have a ground-based field generator, which also suggests he had not read Thrawn's debriefing from the Battle of Atalon. Ozzel's overconfidence removed the opportunity for the fleet to influence a battle that would now have to be fought on the ground. This error cost him his life. With the need to destroy the field generator now of paramount importance, General Maximilian Veers was forced to land at walkers a safe distance away and then march them at speed across the Ace. Veers was probably the Empire's preeminent army commander and had effectively created an entire ground doctrine and tactical formations for the use of walkers in combat. However, the need for haste meant Veers had to push his forces forward far quicker than was reasonably safe, and several of his AT-ATs were left behind in crevasses. Despite Imperial Archives section, Admiral Kendall Orell Flairbridge YQI 872. This record states that Opal was present at tagged DWCH Imperial Archives section, Admiral Kendall Orell Fiel, unedited obituary UO Imperial Archives section, Army Command Doctrine, File Veers Formation, the Battle of Noth and Imperial Marate. The Imperial ground forces were able to overwhelm the rebel down, and the AP, personally commanded by Veers, destroyed the fort with concentrated fire. With it eliminated, Vader, which he wound his assault, runs directly on top of Echo Base and entered the HAS evacuation transports no longer took off under the W of the energy fiat, and were much more vulnerable to attack Rom both above and below. With the rebel base completely breached, the stragglers either safely made it off-world or were swiftly cap-wed when considered along these lines. Hoth appears to be an imperial victory won under difficult circumstances. But even this may not produce a full accounting of the imperial efforts there. As with Palpatine during the Clone Wars, the assumption that Darth Vader was fighting the same galactic civil war as the rest of the imperial forces appears to have been mistaken. Vader may have been spearheading the hunt for the rebel base, but this was not out of any interest in destroying or capturing the rest of the rebel leadership. Hashtag, he was absolutely focused on capturing Luke Skywalker. This single-mindedness had huge implications for the Imperial battle plan. Hashtag, possible that Ossel's decision to emerge directly on top of Hoth was motivated by a desire to appease Vader's demands for progress at great haste. This decision also had a noticeable impact on the ground assault. General Veers suffered serious wounds when his AT-AT was struck by a rebel snowspeeder while undertaking a ground offensive that would not have been necessary if the battle had been better controlled. While rebel evacuation transports escaped at the collapse of the energy shield, Vader was also content to ignore them in favor of chasing the Millennium Ballo in the erroneous belief that Skywalker was on board. This determination led to three of the blockading Star Destroyers being ordered out of their positions to try and chase the ship as it ran for a nearby asteroid field, allowing several Rebel transports to escape through the Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire newly opened gap. Ordinarily, the Empire would have ceased pursuit at the edges of the asteroid field, but Vader ordered his ships to continue the chase, resulting in two of the Star Destroyers, the Ultimatum and the Conquest, being pulverized with the loss of all hands. No sooner had those lives been lost in the fruitless quest than Vader personally executed Captain Nita of the Avenger for allowing the Rebel ship to escape for a second time. Vader subsequently ordered Admiral Firmus Piet, newly promoted to replace Ozzel, to scatter the rest of the Imperial fleet in an ongoing hunt for a single vessel that seemed to be long gone. What should have been an overwhelmingly decisive Imperial victory had collapsed through a mixture of bad initial planning and Vader's determination to place his hunt for Luke Skywalker over the primary strategic objective. It seems scarcely believable, but because of the two lost Star Destroyers, the Empire actually suffered personnel losses, many times greater than those of the Rebel Alliance. Added to this were Sev Aero leading officers dying at the hands of Vader himself, and Veers being so gravely injured as to almost vanish from Imperial records after the battle. Hoth should have been a decisive moment for the Empire in the Galactic Civil War. Instead, the repercussions reverberated through the Imperial military at all levels. After the victory, to understand what appears to have been the underlying reaction within the Imperial military, particularly the fleet in the aftermath of Hoth, it is necessary to begin by remembering the history that led up. Imperial Archives, Section, Military Operations, File, Battle of Hoth to Naval Losses. Archives, Section, Military Operations, Battle of Hoth to Losses. Imperial Archives, Section, General Maximilian Veers. File, Emergency Medical Evacuation. This record shows him being evacuated to Imperial medical facilities near Kurita, but after this it becomes impossible to track down his status. The Battle of Hoth and Imperial morale to this moment. As mentioned in a previous chapter, many within the Imperial fleet would not necessarily be able to say when the Galactic Civil War began. The primary reason for this was because the Empire had essentially been at war since its inception. Though battles designed to conquer worlds or subjugate small uprisings did not really compare with the larger engagements that were to come, they were still combat operations for a military stuck on a perpetual wartime footing. All those months and years expanding the Empire's borders or crushing its enemies would add up over time. There is only so long that a military can keep operating at the same tempo without beginning to lose its edge as fatigue sets in. In the period before Hoth, there are intriguing signs within surviving Imperial records that suggest things may not have been well within the military. Requests for additional morale officers or recreation materials had already doubled within the fleet in the 2 years after Yavin, only to double again in the months leading to Hoth. Instances of both Army and Navy personnel requesting shore leave also increased exponentially as the war dragged, which came to the attention of Compnor, who seemed to believe it was the result of a bug in the request system. Additionally, ISB loyalty officers, who were not well off to begin with, had begun carrying out intensive sweeps of military staff seemingly in response to the defections after Alderaan. The ongoing air of suspicion these investigations caused appeared to have grated on soldiers already under significant combat stress. Imperial Archives, Section, Imperial Navy, File, Special Requisition Orders. EWA specifically see charts 1665 degrees Fahrenheit, 3721 billions, and 4511 U1 Imperial Archives, section, Compnor, file, investigation into extraneous leave requests, Imperial Archives, section, Imperial Security Bureau, file, increased loyalty officer operations, hashtag GT 81625 authorization, Rebel Alliance Archives, section, Intelligence Gathering, file, seized Imperial Communications, 3,001,880. First, these communications were captured in their unedited form during a data raid on Sullust. Individually, all of these items may not add up to much, but together they begin to paint a picture of an imperial military that was starting to fray at the edges before the Battle of Hoth. We know a great deal about the pressures placed on the soldiers of the Rebel Alliance during this period, but what about those of the Empire? The obvious assumption, and the one that has lasted until now, is that given Hoth's status as an imperial victory, the soldiers who fought there would have been elated at their success. They had, after all, chased the rebels from their secret base and inflicted serious casualties upon them, but I do not believe this was the widespread reaction to Hoth, either from those on the ground or those elsewhere. Interrogations of imperial forces after the war backed this belief up to an extent, because, to many Imperials, I believe Hoth represented a huge and demoralizing missed opportunity. Some of this critique came from the fleet in examinations of the battle that, while carefully avoiding overtly blaming Darth Vader, questioned various aspects of the battle plan. The surprise emergence out of hyperspace could have been mitigated if Death Squadron had brought interdictor cruisers with it. Vader and Azel were surely able to request whatever forces they desired, and gravity well technology had been incredibly useful at Talon in preventing the rebels there escaping a planetary blockade. Similarly, the decision to scatter the fleet in a futile hunt for Luke Skywalker had resulted in huge casualties, many of whom were not just names on internal logs, but known colleagues and friends. There must have been many within the military who were wondering whether they too would be sacrificed pursuing a single rebel operative in missions they did not understand. Perhaps the biggest outcome of Hoth, however, was the feeling within the imperial military that a narrative was beginning to develop. See New Republic Archives, section, Imperial Prisoners, file, Interrogations 145,231,459. Imperial Archives, section, Joint Chiefs of the Imperial Military, file, Battle of Hoth analysis. The Battle of Hoth and imperial morale. That was not in their favor. While there would have been precious few serving in the Empire's armed forces that believed in the Force, or would ever say so out loud, soldiers can be superstitious. Morale in military environments is a peculiar thing. It is based almost entirely on personal and shared feelings. My own service with the resistance has given me experience of the ways morale can ebb and flow. If soldiers believe they are winning, their chances of doing so increase exponentially. They become willing to fight harder, suffer longer, even sustain personal wounds and losses, simply because it feels like victory is in reach and the casualties become worth it. The reverse of this can begin to happen when soldiers believe they are losing. On the narrative emerging within some sections of the military pointed to the fact that every time the Empire had a chance of winning the war and defeating the opposition, their enemy escaped. It happened at Atolon. It happened at Yavin. It happened at Mako Ta. And now it had happened again at Hoth. And with every subsequent escape, every imperial victory that did not bring the conclusion of the war closer despite their own forces sustaining heavy losses, imperial morale eroded away. By the Battle of Hoth, most soldiers serving the Empire who were going to defect and join the rebel alliance had already done so. There were still those waiting for the right opportunity, but years had passed since the Empire's worst crime and then greatest humbling. Defection was, regardless of what the ISB loyalty officers seemed to believe, no longer an ongoing concern. The same cannot be said of desertions. These records are buried very deep within remaining imperial holdings, and they are still heavily redacted to this day, but there appears to have been a noticeable spike of desertions from the Army and Navy in the Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, immediate aftermath of Hoth. It is possible that these soldiers were either so fatigued or demoralized by the ongoing nature of the war that they just disappeared, or they simply abandoned their positions and slipped away into the civilian population. The Empire could not spare the resources to track them all down, not during an ongoing war. The impact of Hoth on a military that was already becoming tired and ground down by the nature of the conflict they were engaged in does not appear to have been any form of joy. At best, a weary resignation that the struggle would have to be maintained set in. But even this was undermined by a nagging but growing fear that whatever war they were fighting was not one shared by their commander, Darth Vader. And if it was not feared by him, then was it not feared by the Emperor either? How was it going to be possible to win the war if their leaders ignored the obvious objectives directly in front of them in favor of their own agendas? How many times would victory be allowed to slip away for reasons the rank and file did not understand? As the Alliance scrambled to escape Hoth, some rebel units aimed to create as much havoc and chaos as possible in order to alleviate the pressure on their fellows. From this idea came the abortive Operation Ringbreaker undertaken by the Rebel 61 Infantry Company, who sought to fight their way across Imperial space in an attempt to take the shipyard at Kuat. While this push ended prematurely at Sullust, it may have been far more successful in exacerbating the damage to Imperial morale than the soldiers of Twilight Company could have ever expected. Imperial soldiers across the galaxy had gone from waiting with anticipation for news of an Imperial victory that ended the war to suddenly having to deal with unfolding hit and fade operations in previously. The Battle of Hoth and Imperial morale, secure strongholds. The damage to infrastructure was notable, but the damage to the psyche of Imperial soldiers may have been more severe. As the war dragged on, I believe that faith in an Imperial victory was beginning to ebb away within the military. Sapped by fatigue and fear of what was to come, the Imperial Navy was losing both its edge and its control over military operations that clashed with Darth Vader's own desires. The Empire could not easily survive many more victories such as the one achieved at Hoth. This would lead to a serious reconsideration of strategic options in the lead up to Endor. But it also made many within the military vulnerable to the approaches of an organization that was separate from the Rebel Alliance, but which had also identified the main problem in the galaxy as being the rule of Darth Vader and his Emperor. Chapter 19: Crimson Dawn. WT8: The Galactic Civil War. Ongoing and no immediate end in sight. The Empire was concentrating the vast majority of their forces on maintaining control of the galaxy and attempting to defeat the Rebel Alliance. The inability, largely as a result of the Death Star's destruction at Yavin, of the Empire to win the war Swali had produced a deepening crisis across Imperial territory. The longer the conflict dragged on, and the greater the perceived difficulties of the Empire in defeating the rebellion, the more populations began to wonder, some openly, whether Imperial control was sustainable in the long run. The survival of the Rebel Alliance was producing circumstances that would soon beget more rebellions. As a result, The Empire was caught in a trap largely of their own making. They had trained through tyranny, a population that would not question their brutal methods because the Empire was strong enough to deal out summary, violent retribution. But that strength ebbed away every day that the rebels eluded the Imperial military. To compensate, Imperial forces and garrisons were increased on particularly rebellious or unstable worlds to try and maintain order, but at the cost of weakening the forces that might catch and destroy the alliance immediacy of the rebel threat. However, in focusing so much on the Empire had allowed itself to be distracted from a very different enemy that was lurking beneath the surface. Imperial forces, including Darth. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Vader had always had an unusual relationship with the galaxy's major criminal enterprises. While there were plenty of Imperial soldiers and officers who were also on the payrolls of groups like the Hutt Cartel or Pike Syndicate, there was also a generally understood arrangement that direct encroachment or obstruction of Imperial business, particularly the war effort, would be met with harsh reprisals. The likes of Black Sun may have been strong, but they were in no position to slug it out with the Imperial fleet. As the Empire shifted increasing forces away from maintaining the infrastructure of the state, particularly trade and industry, they abandoned many previously controlled aspects of civilian life. But he was not the true power or driving force of Crimson Dawn. Originally, it had been the fallen Sith Lord Maul. As he had done during the Clone Wars with the Death Watch Mandalorians, Maul used the criminal groups governed by Crimson Dawn as a way to build his own power base, while he controlled the direction of the group through VOS, but more specifically through his protege, a young Corellian woman called Shira. If Maul had been the origin of Crimson Dawn, his disappearance left Shira as the inheritor of Crimson Dawn. She had apparently learned a great deal from Maul and was, under the cover of the Galactic Civil War, preparing her own conflict. But hers was not one aimed simply at the Empire broadly defined. Instead, she had a very specific target in mind, one that she had identified through Maul's teachings and her own work in gathering information and secrets across the galaxy. For while the rebels sought to confront the Empire in all its guises, Shira and Crimson Dawn were about to declare war on the Sith, the specter of Crimson Dawn. There are a great many questions about the operations and activities of Crimson Dawn during the period between the battles of Hoth and Endor. A little frustratingly, there are also precious few official answers to those questions. This means it becomes necessary to evaluate the evidence that is available to us, including material that might seem tangential to the topic, while also evaluating the various aspects of Crimson Dawn's mythos. In the simplest terms, there is a single unifying aspect to the story of Crimson Dawn's assault on Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. Essentially, through a mixture of bribery and financial incentives and through playing on the sentiments of both criminal operatives and Imperial personnel, Crimson Dawn, under the command of Shira, allegedly infiltrated almost every level of the Empire's hierarchy, and used this power to try and destroy the Sith. It was this version of events that was reported by Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa. having been recounted to them through a holocron, a Jedi tool used for recording history, by someone calling herself the Archivist. Descriptions of her suggest she may once have been a scholar at the University of Barleth, while there is no specific reason to doubt. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. This version, and elements of it will be included here. There are significant issues in corroborating it. Much of this is understandable. For example, there are precious few surviving references to Crimson Dawn within Imperial archives or records. However, I would expect this to be the case whether the stories were true or not. If the archivist was mistaken or lying, then there would be no supporting evidence to exist in the first place. Similarly, if Crimson Dawn had so thoroughly infiltrated the Empire as claimed, then that feels like exactly the sort of situation where Imperial authorities would purge all records of the events in question. Therefore, regardless of whether the archivist was correct, the absence of evidence in the Imperial records remains the same. Fortunately, we are not restricted to just the official version of events that the Empire has left us with. There are other ways of examining this moment. While the Imperial archives do not contain much information that is of use to us, there are other ways of gathering information regarding this period in the Empire. Numerous captured Imperial soldiers and officers spoke about Crimson Dawn when interrogated by the New Republic after the war. Several more mention it briefly in their post-war memoirs. What is interesting from these recollections is the extent to which Crimson Dawn almost came to resemble a strangely intangible ongoing fear within the Empire. If something bad happened, something broke, or a comrade went missing, who quite possibly could have deserted, it seems to have become the norm to wonder if Crimson Dawn were behind it. As a result, some of the stories Imperials seem to have told each other about the actions of Crimson Dawn and Lady Chira are even more outlandish than the version the archivist presented to Luke and Leia. This, in fact, may have been a significant aspect of the Crimson Dawn operation. In effect, they did not have to even attempt a fraction of the things that were later attributed to them. If enough Imperials believed they were behind anything and everything that was happening during this period, a period that, as has already been mentioned, saw Imperial morale already dropping significantly, then their reputation was enhanced regardless. The mystique of Crimson Dawn grew simply by people believing and sharing stories about their alleged activities. In this sense, Crimson Dawn's reputation worked in a strangely similar way to how the Death Star had been intended to operate under the Tarkin doctrine. The fear of their involvement was more powerful than their actual actions. Additionally, the Galactic Empire was not the only organization interacting with Crimson Dawn. The Rebel Alliance had their own dealings with Chira's group and made their own evaluations as a result. While it does not appear that Crimson Dawn actively courted the Rebel Alliance as a full ally, perhaps instead preferring to use them as a distraction for the Empire, there were apparently some meetings between the likes of Chira and Leia Organa, ostensibly about Han Solo, who was sealed in carbonite at the time. The rebels were able to view aspects of unfolding events from the sidelines, and there were certainly some within Rebel High Command who believed that Crimson Dawn was attempting some form of attack on the Empire. Alongside this, parts of the galaxy's criminal underworld were also caught up in what appears to have been an internecine conflict for the Emperor's favor, which may have also been prompted by Crimson Dawn, and this at least does appear in Imperial records. Trying to gauge the actual membership of Crimson Dawn is difficult. At various points in its lifespan, it was either advantageous or dangerous to claim allegiance to the group. For some, suggesting they were a member could grant them extra clout within the underworld, or, if an Imperial soldier, the possibility of being spared when captured by the Rebel Alliance. Similarly, disavowing any connection to a Rebel Alliance Archives section, Crimson Dawn, file, Lady Chira meeting on the Millennium Falcon Rebel Alliance Archives, section, Crimson Dawn file, Ongoing analysis #25war. Chira, after Crimson Dawn's fall, or when placed at the mercy of an Imperial interrogation droid, might be enough to avoid death. Many who said they were part of Crimson Dawn probably were not. Some who denied it certainly were. It is increasingly difficult following the passage of time to discern the fact from the fiction. But despite this, we can begin to draw some conclusions. War on the Sith. While Darth Vader was sometimes referred to within the Imperial hierarchy as a Sith Lord, whether Imperial officers really understood what that meant or not, Palpatine continued to keep his own true powers and loyalties highly secret. As a result, the list of people who would have known about them and been willing to risk speaking about them is exceptionally short and has to include Maul. There is enough material already gathered from the excavation here in Exegol to show that Palpatine took an ongoing interest in the activities of his former apprentice, with a significant increase in notations and records relating to his relationship with Crimson Dawn. It is therefore not a huge leap to suggest that Palpatine at least believed that Maul may have been the one to provide details of his true identity to Chira. Why exactly Chira saw fit to proceed with an attack against Palpatine and Vader is unclear. The archivist alleged that was born out of an anger and frustration at how the Sith manipulated the rest of the galaxy to live in varying degrees of misery. Given what we know of Chira's early life growing up in the slums of Corellia, where she also spent time enslaved, her anger at the rulers of the galaxy is not that different to the sort that motivated many others to join the Rebel Alliance. New Republic Archives section, Crimson Dawn, the archivist's holocron file, Chira's motivations, Crimson Dawn. What is interesting about the actions that Crimson Dawn aimed to take against the Sith is how surprisingly unprepared the Emperor and Darth Vader were for them. The Galactic Civil War was likely an ongoing distraction, particularly given the emergence of Luke Skywalker. Similarly, there was no shortage of people who wanted Palpatine or Vader dead. Perhaps the almost universal defeat of the Jedi Order had left the two Sith Lords a little complacent regarding their own position and identities. This would not be the last time that Palpatine in particular would misread a danger to himself, and they assumed that direct attacks on them were likely to come via the Rebel Alliance as part of its war on the Empire. However, as this work is aimed to highlight, the Sith and the Empire are not entirely synonymous. While this has relevance for the way in which the rebels fought their war, it also relates to how Chira had less interest in fighting Imperial forces than she did on gunning, for the two stood at the top of the hierarchy. The opening moves of this attack appear to have been carried out while many in both the Empire and the criminal underworld were trying to take ownership of Han Solo's carbonite-encased body. Following some sort of controversy between Darth Vader and the Hutt Lord Boku over an auction for Solo, Boku launched an attack on the Superstar Destroyer Executor to try and reclaim his prize. While this attack failed and led to the death of Baku and the rest of the Hutt Council, Boba Fett was able to take possession of Han Solo and deliver him to Jabba the Hutt, whose position was now greatly strengthened. However, a rumor began to spread that because of the Hutt's treachery, the Empire was now willing to dissolve their previous preferential relationship and replace them with a new syndicate. So convincing was this rumor that it even director Barsha, of whom very little is cartel, file, attack on the executor Leia. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, known of the ISB. 10. The result of this rumor, which was almost certainly started by Crimson Dawn, was an outbreak of inter-rival warfare between the various crime lords of the galaxy and their related organizations. To try and put down this conflict, the Empire was forced to pull ships from actions against the rebels, thereby its efforts in the Galactic Civil War and providing an ongoing distraction. It was apparently this distraction that Shira desired in order to stage an escalation of her plans. Events from this point onward become a mix of convoluted and potentially implausible. According to the archivist, Crimson Dawn fashioned a loose alliance of assorted criminals and Imperial personnel who had been acting as sleeper agents to wage war on multiple fronts. At least part of this plan involved overt moves against both Darth Vader and the Emperor. The archivist suggests that one aspect of this was a mass assassination by poison of the Imperial Royal Guard serving at the Imperial Palace on Coruscant. How this would have been possible is hard to imagine, as these individuals must have been some of the most carefully isolated and vetted people in the galaxy. However, there is also a record in Imperial databases requesting additional personnel be transferred to Coruscant from Yukor, one of the training hubs for the Royal Guard. So while implausible, it is possible there is some underlying truth to the claim. Events like these may also be examples from within the Imperial military of the impact the threat of Crimson Dawn was having. Even if something did happen to those Royal Guard, it is not necessarily the case that Crimson Dawn were behind it, but the belief. 10 Imperial Archives section, Imperial Security Bureau, file, Syndicate War Query memo from Director Barsha. Imperial Archives section, Imperial Navy, file, Highest Priority Redeployment Order 51,192nd Emperor Palpatine's Clearance Code. 12 New Republic Archives section, Crimson Dawn, the Archivist's Holocron file, Crimson Reign. Imperial Archives section, Yinkor Training Facility, file, Urgent Transfer Order XJ810177. Crimson Dawn. That they could be and could in fact anywhere, even more so than the rebels, stoked a particular form of paranoia, which was undoubtedly beneficial to Chira. There are certainly signs that this paranoia had begun to reach into the upper echelons as well. There appears to have been a significant purge of Imperial military personnel and advisors affiliated with Crimson Dawn. Again, the archivist suggests that this purge was based upon false information provided to the Empire, and that around 50% of those on the list were Imperial loyalists. This is incredibly difficult to verify. Regardless, while the Emperor and Vader perhaps believed this was the surest and safest way of rooting out the Crimson Dawn agents within the Empire, we can only wonder how badly it impacted wider Imperial morale at a time when it was already dangerously eroding. 18. The culmination of Chira's plans appears to have been executed at Maxine Station. It was there that she gathered the majority of Crimson Dawn's military forces in preparation for a battle against the Executor, and, on the station itself, against the two Dark Lords of the Sith. The focal point of this battle is especially difficult to unpack. The archivist mentions a form of force weapon known as the Fermata Cage, and there have been references to it uncovered on Exegol. Exactly how this weapon worked, or what Chira intended to do with it, isn't clear. But it was clearly concerning enough to lure Palpatine from Coruscant, something that was practically unheard of by this point in the Empire's history. We may never know exactly what happened on the station itself, but there is evidence that the battle caused some sort of disturbance in Imperial Archives, section, Crimson Dawn Purge, file, execution orders. This list is lengthy, and many of the names on it had been removed. 13 New Republic Archives, section, Crimson Dawn, the Archivist's Holocron file, False Collaborators List Array Exegol Excavation Project section, Force Artifacts, Files, Fermata Cagua information, retrieved from the Arcane Library. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. The Force. For some time afterward, Luke Skywalker noted that his ability to use the Force was greatly hampered, and that the energy field itself seemed to be in some sort of flux. Whatever happened on Amaxine Station, both Palpatine and Vader survived it seemingly unscathed. In orbit, the forces of Crimson Dawn were demolished by the Executor, and Admiral Piet gave orders that no prisoners were to be taken, and no lives spared. At the conclusion of the battle, Crimson Dawn was effectively destroyed, and Lady Chira had vanished. Whatever the intended outcome of her long-running plan, Chira had clearly failed. The archivist mentioned that she never heard from the leader of Crimson Dawn ever again. After the dawn. In some ways, this might be thought of as the end of Crimson Dawn and their influence on the galaxy. Certainly, they do not appear to have been major players for the rest of the Galactic Civil War, though various offshoot organizations rebranded themselves as the inheritors of Kira's power and legacy. The failure of Crimson Dawn ostensibly left the Empire, and particularly Palpatine and Vader, free to focus on the threat of the Rebel Alliance. However, events rarely end so swiftly and without ongoing consequences. Though they had won their battle against Crimson Dawn, the Empire was notably weakened by it, and this would have repercussions. Wiping out an additional enemy and maintaining order in the galaxy, it also provided yet Archives section, Luke Skywalker, file, Force Wave Imperial Archives, section, Military Operations, file, Battle at Amaxine Station to Admiral Piet's Rules of Engagement. Crimson Dawn. Another example of the Emperor and Darth Vader paying scant regard to the requirements of the people, who were actually running the war effort. Rom the Joint Chiefs down to individual commanders, located at the last moment and not replaced. During this period, the Rebel Alliance had, having been burned by their flight from Hoth, largely eschewed planetary bases of operations and were running the war effort out of the Rebel fleet itself. This presented some obvious dangers should the ships be ambushed or trapped by interdictor cruisers, but did give them more flexibility when it came to making their escape. It was also not a long-term solution. It was expensive for the rebellion to keep its fleet constantly on the move, and its vessels required ongoing supply. While it is difficult to know whether or not the extra ships that were diverted away from the front lines to fight Crimson Dawn would have made a difference in tracking down the rebel military, their absence certainly did not help. Furthermore, many Imperial officers and soldiers had witnessed friends and comrades be summarily executed for alleged links to Crimson Dawn. Whether those links existed or not is almost immaterial, particularly as those giving the execution orders had no interest in showing their evidence to bystanders. But the impact was noticeable. Numerous Imperial prisoners after the war have expressed how a mixture of fear and horror had spread through the fleet as yet another purge was carried out, this one in the middle of a significant ongoing conflict. Imperial morale may already have been in a downward spiral, and having significant numbers of experienced soldiers killed for treason, which may not have existed, only exacerbated the situation. There were also additional military implications. Seasoned captains and commanders, experienced pilots, battle-hardened soldiers were among those to die. These were incredibly valuable for a state at war. While new reinforcements could take their place, the experience and military know-how they possessed was lost. Palpatine and Vader were primarily focused on the importance of loyalty. This came at the expense of weakening their own military as the war was reaching its endgame. Because in and among all the other activities of Crimson Dawn was one which would have enormous repercussions on the outcome of the Galactic Civil War. In many respects, Lieutenant John Melton and his wife Bevelyn, a cargo worker, were unremarkable Imperial personnel among millions of others. However, Because of Lieutenant Milton's job as an aide to Moff Tian Yurgarad, he was privy to one of the greatest secrets currently held by the Empire, the existence of the second Death Star currently under construction. They were also sleeper agents for Crimson Dawn. The pair were subsequently activated and instructed, along with many others, to assist in causing chaos within the Empire. In response, John Melton and Bevelin took their children, stole an Imperial shuttle, and subsequently defected to the Rebel Alliance, bringing their information with them. The news they brought sent ripples of shock through the Rebel High Command, but also exposed the determination with which Palpatine still clung on to his vision of a galaxy ruled by the fear of a Death Star. This revelation dramatically changed the long-term objectives of the Rebel Alliance at exactly the point when the Imperial Navy was being forced to reconsider its own approach to the Galactic Civil War. While Lady Kira Crimson Dawn may have failed in her own quest to destroy the Sith and liberate the galaxy, she had, perhaps unwittingly, put the Empire and the Rebel Alliance on a collision course for a grand battle that would decide the outcome of the war. Maybe she had one after all. 21. Rebel Alliance Archives, Section, Second Death Star, File, John Melton and Bevelin Debriefing. The Battle of Endor. It's hard to imagine a more seismic moment. Even given recent events in contemporary galactic history than that which transpired at Endor more than 30 years ago. Even regardless of the battle's eventual outcome, the rationale for fighting it in the first place was the end point of years of accumulating decisions, political circumstances, and military concerns. I know that Rey, Leia Organa, and Luke Skywalker believed, as did Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader, that the Force could influence events to almost make them seem predestined. Given everything that has been outlined in this study so far, it is perhaps true that the Battle of Endor was the natural conclusion not just of Palpatine's empire, but the decisions he and others had made while ruling it. If Endor was to prove the death of the Empire, it was one of Palpatine's own making. As with other battles that have been mentioned in this work, the intention here is not to go over old ground regarding exact troop movements and the like, particularly not as an updated version of that analysis is underway from several of my colleagues. However, there are things that I believe need to be either reevaluated or, alternatively, examined for the first time regarding the Battle of Endor. Some of this material, as with my new conclusions relating to the Battle of Hoth and other crucial moments in the Empire's history, is contested, for reasons that are understandable and will be covered in greater detail below. But, subject of ongoing consideration by both military historians and practitioners, I still believe there to be significant question marks regarding why the Empire chose to fight at Endor at all and the background to their battle plans. It is only through the wider considerations that I have attempted to highlight throughout this study that answers to some of those questions are now beginning to appear. This is because the events of Endor did not take place isolated from all that had come before. While Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader were both present at Endor, their focus on Luke Skywalker essentially meant that the battle outside was left to the service people of the Imperial fleet. In theory, the greatest collection of ships that the Galactic Empire had ever committed to battle should have been ample to destroy a rebel fleet that had been caught completely by surprise. Similarly, the Imperial forces on the surface of Endor should not have been outmaneuvered and defeated by a mixture of rebel commandos and indigenous Ewoks. And yet both defeats happened. The reasons why likely rest on everything that had happened and would happen in the prelude to the rebel fleet emerging from hyperspace. Strategic crises. In the lead up to the Battle of Endor, both the Galactic Empire and the Rebel Alliance were effectively grappling with the same strategic problem, Neither of them was actually getting any closer to winning the war. While there had been various notable victories and defeats along the way, the overall balance of power in the galaxy was much the same as it had been for most of the war. The rebels were continuing to grow in number and power, but not so much as to threaten the type of sudden surge or revolution that might sweep them to victory. Similarly, the Galactic Empire's forces faced much the same challenge as they had since Yavin. They were struggling to locate rebel bases or force the defeat into a decisive engagement. Recent events had not improved matters noticeably on either side. With Crimson, the issues the Empire had recently faced in dealing Dawn had ongoing repercussions. Some form of droid infection aboard the Executor had resulted in several Star Destroyers being forced to try and destroy the vessel to prevent it from spreading. While the Super Star Destroyer had eventually been purged, it had come at the expense of at least one of the attacking Star Destroyers and the death of Admiral Korlek. The need to retain the Executor, given its vast expense and firepower, but also because many of the best officers in the fleet were on board, was obvious. But the death of Korlek and the destruction of his flagship, the Unbreakable, once again robbed the Empire of an officer, crew, and vessel who were desperately needed. Similarly, the ships that had been pulled from service to deal with Crimson Dawn had left gaps in the Imperial fleet deployments that had still not been rebalanced. At the Battle of Ponolapo, a small rebel fleet had ambushed an Imperial convoy. Ordinarily, the escorting Star Destroyer Steadfast would have been accompanied by several Gozanti Arquitens light cruisers, but, in this case, it was alone. As a result, the rebels were able to destroy most of the Imperial shipping and damage the Steadfast, even managing to kill Commodore Freylan on the way out. Across the galaxy, the rebels and the Empire were engaging in small skirmishes that resulted in ships and lives being traded on both sides, but never in great enough numbers to shift the wider dynamic of the conflict. The rebels were just as wary as ever of committing to a battle that, if lost, would cost them the war. The Empire continued trying to marshal their forces while balancing their strategic focus between the likes of the Rebellion or Crimson Dawn. However, there was also Imperial Archives, military operations, file, attack on the Executor Eggy. This record, and others like it, have been censored heavily as see Rebel Alliance Archives, military operations, file, Battle of Ponolapo, and Imperial Archives section, Imperial Navy, file, Commodore Freylan obituary. Another major construction project underway that would change the thinking of both sides of the Galactic Civil War. The ongoing development of the second Death Star showed in the clearest of terms that Palpatine had not changed his aims since Yavin. He wanted the ability to destroy entire planets and the fear that such a battle station would provide. The intervening years had not dimmed this desire, and he had once again resolved to dedicate as many resources as were necessary to achieve it. Perhaps the most noticeable change with this new project was the decision as to who was placed in charge. As previously noted, the original Death Star had become a battlefield upon which Wilhuff Tarkin and Orson Krennic played out their ambitions. Though Tarkin had won that struggle, his victory had been brief. His death at Yavin had been a tremendous blow to the Empire. The person chosen to replace him on the new construction project Moff Tien Yergerod was not another Tarkin. But perhaps that was the point. While Yergerod lacked Tarkin's vision and ability to project power, he also appears to have been much less ambitious. Yergerod had served stints on the Joint Chiefs in the years since Yavin, and was not viewed as a burgeoning power behind the throne figure in the ways that Tarkin had sometimes been. Yergerod was a more limited man, but was also all the more controllable as a result. Put simply, someone like Vader could threaten and scare him in a way that he could not do with Tarkin. While the new Death Star had been under construction for some time, the Rebel Alliance had learned of its existence, probably sooner than the Empire would have liked. The site at Endor was well defended both by assets from the Imperial fleet and by a field generator on the forest moon's surface, but ongoing delays had slowed progress, and there were still questions over when the main infrastructure and firepower of the station would be completed. However, the Death Star also. Imperial Archives, Section, Second Death Star Construction, File, Moff Tianjurjerud. Of wider strategic conversations within both the Empire and the Rebel Alliance regarding how best to bring the war to a conclusion. Vestingly, it seemed that the conclusion taken on both sides resembled an exchange of military stances. The problem facing the Galactic Empire had long been that they could not force the Rebel Alliance into a confrontation that might result in a decisive victory. There had been numerous attempts over the years, not least at Atolon Yavin Makota, but they had been squandered. As time had gone on, the rebels had become even more reluctant to stand and fight on a battleground they themselves had not chosen. When faced with a choice between victory or survival, the rebels often chose survival and escaped. The Empire could chase the rebels around the galaxy for years to come and still get no closer to winning the war. They needed to find some way of making the rebels come to them. At the same time, the Alliance military was also grappling with the problem that while survival was necessary to ensure the rebellion's ongoing chances, simply existing was not the same as winning. The rebels, understandably, were highly reluctant to risk their combined military forces in any battles that would not dramatically benefit their overall chances of victory. But as a result, their reticence to fight meant that the Empire remained in control of the galaxy and billions continued to struggle under its oppressive conditions. The rebels were not willing to just throw their fleet into any battles that appeared, but the longer liberation of the galaxy was delayed, the greater the chances that people would begin to lose hope it was ever coming. If the steady stream of recruits and resources from across the galaxy was to dwindle, then the Alliance could founder. Leading rebel military figures were already evaluating possible targets for a concerted attack that would provide both a needed morale boost and potentially tip the balance of power in their favor. Then news of the new Death Star arrived. There was an understandable amount of doubt and suspicion about the news, and rebel spies were deployed across the galaxy to try and confirm it. The Alliance, particularly, drew upon the efforts of both and spies in order to gather information. Not only did these attempts produce information regarding the Death Star's location, defenses, and general state of completion, it also provided news that nobody in the rebellion could have foreseen. Emperor Palpatine himself was due to visit the battle station to inspect its construction. Even before the Battle of Yavin, Palpatine had effectively become a recluse on Coruscant. In the years since, the very notion of him publicly traveling beyond the imperial capital was almost unheard of. If Palpatine was going to be away from the safety of Coruscant aboard a target the rebels were already planning to attack, then suddenly the war-winning opportunity they had long been searching for had arrived. We now know that Palpatine's presence at Endor was not the coincidence the rebels believed it to be. Great efforts were made to ensure that the rebels knew exactly when Palpatine would be on board the battle station. The Empire's need to drag the rebels out of hiding was just as strong as the rebels' need to secure a military victory. The outcome was to heavily bait the trap at Endor by seemingly providing the rebels with all the motivation they required to finally come out and fight. In Effectuate Endor was almost designed as a reversal of the Battle of Yavin, Lyre. 5 Rebel Alliance Archives, Section, Intelligence Operations, File, Second Death Star. Both the WE Archives, Section, Espionage Network File, Rebel Alliance Operation AHRM 612D Saka. This record is almost entirely redacted. Rebel Alliance Archives Section, Military Operations File, Battle of Endor Briefing. This record was created and filed by Dora Maar in her role as a chronicler on Home One. Rebel Alliance Archives Section, Military Operations File, Battle of Endor Preparation. See in a re-debriefing, the Battle of Endor. With the rebels looking to launch a destructive assault while the Empire aimed to draw them into a trap. As a result, it seems like the Empire had all the advantages it could possibly require. What happened next remains highly contested. Breaking point. There are points during the work of a historian when discover accounts of a single event that are so contradictory as to cause serious problems in attempting to understand what actually happened. How could eyewitnesses and participants of something produce such wildly differing accounts of an event they all supposedly experienced? How do we begin to discern which version is the most likely? These are questions that are highly relevant when it comes to an examination of Admiral Piet's briefing on board the Executor for the Battle of Endor. Before digging into the conflicting accounts of this meeting, it is perhaps best to begin by confirming what is already established in various records and considering the arguments this study has made regarding the overall position of the Imperial Navy at this point in the war. The details of the exact vessels that the Empire fielded at Endor are already well known, but it is worth acknowledging that whether it was Piet himself or the Joint Chiefs who made the decision regarding the fleet's composition, a number of the most experienced commanders and ships were present. Admiral Sloane and the Vigilance were present, as were Admiral Versio's Eviscerator, Vice Admiral Furno's Dark Omen, and Admiral Montferrat with the Devastator. These ships and their commanders had seen extensive action against the Rebel Alliance across the entirety of the war, while there were those like Commodore Skanos aboard the Steadfast or Captain Inalis. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Of the interrogator who did not have quite as extensive military careers, by and large the Imperial fleet at Endor was an incredibly capable one. With Moff Gerard himself joining the briefing remotely, however, when considering the senior officers present, it is also important to note that they were spread across the ideological and doctrinal split within the military, and also because of the nature of their service to date, or perhaps some of the longest serving. This becomes relevant in due course. What is also established is that at the opening of the meeting, Admiral Piet gave a shorter briefing regarding the expected nature of the ground battle to General Falk, who commanded the Army forces, and Major Huex, who led the naval contingent on the moon's surface. Communication records captured after the battle indicate that the briefing communication sent from orbit was not a lengthy one. Similarly, orders were also given to the assorted starfighter commanders regarding general battle formations and the initial wave that was designed to disrupt rebel fleet formations and pin them in place. All of these aspects are either corroborated within the records of various star destroyers after the briefing concluded, or, in the case of the Executor, transmitted back to Coruscant. Admiral Piet's transmission also effectively contains what has become the official version of the senior officer's briefing, which was also, apparently, reasonably short. In it, he outlined that the assembled fleet would hold their position between the rebels and their escape route, while interdictor cruisers would ensure there was no chance of their enemy fleeing into hyperspace. While details were not given about the special plans of Emperor Palpatine, it was made clear that the assorted star destroyers were not expected to take an active. 10 Rebel Alliance Archives, Section Endor File, captured Imperial communication logs, #YN309. For evidence of this, see the records recovered from the Dark Omen and the wreckage of the Steadfast and Devastator. The Battle of Endor. Part in the battle. Versions of this account are also found within the records of the Steadfast and the Interrogator. The Altar. However, this is not the only account of this meeting and native one, while seeming in some ways highly implausible, does have some very compelling and interesting aspects. Because this version suggests that rather than a relatively simple pre-battle briefing, what actually occurred was upon hearing of the Emperor's orders, an outpouring of all the built-up tension, stress, and fatigue of years of warfare from the assembled officers in the form of a blazing argument. Several of those who either recorded elements of this event or recalled it after the fact have made a tendency to anonymize those speaking, but some efforts can be made to identify specific individuals. It appears that at least some of those present were incensed by the idea of luring the rebel alliance into a trap and then not finishing them off as quickly as possible. One officer is quoted as shouting, "Can we just once, for Criff's sake, win the war? How many times do we have to let Vader or His Majesty mess things up when victory is right here? It's right here, just win the war!" This outburst provoked accusations of high treason from an unnamed source, who was probably either Admiral Montferrat, given his close affiliation to Darth Vader, or Admiral Versio, who was a die-hard loyalist. Side argument also appears to have emerged regarding the plan of sending in the starfighters first, but without backing them up or holding enough reserves in place to defend the fleet. This part laid bare the ongoing factions and differences in opinion regarding the way the Imperial Navy could have been waging the war. One officer, presumably Vice Admiral Furno, began an explanation of how Grand Admiral Thrawn had coordinated the fighters and fleet at Atolon, before another figure reportedly shouted him down with a cry of, "If I have to, listen to one more lecture about what that ludicrous alien would have done. I am going to allow my ship to indulge in friendly fire," before beginning to ascertain the evidence that either supports or undermines this version of events. It is important to begin by considering why it may have happened at all. For imperial officers, particularly those of a higher rank, to dislike each other is not particularly surprising. Senior figures throughout the empire tended to treat their fellows with a degree of suspicion. The system practically encouraged it. Furthermore, we also know that the imperial military, and the fleet especially, had long been riven with factions and splits regarding overall strategy and doctrine. This had simmered under the surface for a prolonged period with occasional outbreaks of infighting at moments when the war was going badly. I have also argued that, following the Imperial victory at Hoth, a lot of military personnel had begun to feel the strain of waging the Galactic Civil War, and morale had begun to degrade as opportunities for victory slipped through their fingers. Is it possible that the stress of these circumstances had finally pushed some of the gathered officers over the edge? That the notion of the rebel fleet landing directly into a well-laid trap only for the whole victory to be jeopardized because the Emperor had something special planned was so infuriating to senior fleet personnel that they would actually criticize both Vader and Palpatine in such an overt way? It does not seem to be so unrealistic as to be impossible. So how do we assess the evidence? Well, the records of those who say this argument did not happen are fairly clear. While several of these sources are junior commanders, at least in comparison to some of the others assembled, Admiral Piet is a pretty strong source, and his broadcast to Coruscant is straightforward in its appraisal of events. Found in an unpublished memoir entitled Hero of the Empire, written by an anonymous Imperial commander, that was located within the records Yaga Minor. The Battle of Endor. According to both Piet's transmission and those junior officers, this argument simply did not occur. However, There is room for contemplation regarding these sources. For example, Commodore Skanos returned to the Steadfast a full standard hour and a half before Admiral Ray Sloan returned to the Vigilance. Is it possible that the more fiery events actually took place in a closed briefing for the senior officers to air their grievances, and that Commodore Skanos did not report the arguments simply because he was not there to witness them? This may have been a way for Piet to consult with the highest ranking commanders, many of whom had served together on the Joint Chiefs, in a way that allowed him to keep the dispute in fleet without causing him an issue with his own reports. This seems like a possible explanation, but we must also be critical with the accounts of those who claim the dispute took place. Several of those who have provided information on the argument did so while under interrogation by the New Republic at the end of the war. In those circumstances, presenting a version of events which distanced them from the Emperor and Darth Vader and allowed them to appear as professionals just trying to do their job had obvious benefits. Additionally, an unpublished anonymous memoir, while interesting, presents any number of problems when it comes to evaluating its veracity. There is one curious outcome of the meeting, though, that may provide us with an opportunity to decide on its likelihood one way or another. As has been mentioned before, the ISB's loyalty officers were not beloved individuals across the Imperial military. They were often viewed as unwelcome additions on board a ship at best, and at worst, spies who fomented more trouble and suspicion than was ever in existence in the first place. I have previously argued that the activities of ISB loyalty officers around the Battle of Hoth and then the activities of Crimson Dawn probably caused a great deal of damage to the morale of Imperial soldiers. Shortly after the briefing on board the Executor took place, it appears that contingents of loyalty officers were redeployed. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. From the Death Star onto the various Star Destroyers gathered at Endor. Why exactly this was done and who gave the order for it are unknown. But it certainly strikes me as highly interesting timing that so soon after a supposed outbreak of almost treasonous or mutinous anger within the fleet, loyalty officers would be placed upon the bridges of those vessels. We may never know for certain what, if anything, happened in the command chamber of the Executor that day. Many of those present were either killed in the battle or in those to come. However, I do not believe it is implausible to say that there were some among the gathered officers who feared an imminent disaster. They were correct. Cataclysm. As previously noted, there has been, and will continue to be, much in-depth analysis as to exactly how the Empire managed to construct an absolutely crushing defeat from a situation that greatly favored their victory, and I have no wish to refight the battle here. However, there is some value in trying to explain exactly why the Imperial fleet ended up functioning so far below its expected combat abilities. Obviously, it is important to note quite how hobbled the Star Destroyers were by Emperor Palpatine's orders not to move forward to engage the Rebel fleet. It cost them a great deal of their advantage, a significant portion of their TIE forces, and most of the initiative. These were not the only factors in play at Endor. It is entirely possible that the Rebel fleet was better led than the Empire's, as Admiral Akbar was a formidable battle commander. But combat is not simply decided by those in charge, and, regardless, there was a great deal of military experience on the Imperial side. There is a benefit at this point to considering the Executor as a case study. It had long been believed. 15 Imperial Archives, Section, Imperial Security Bureau, File, Additional Deployment at Endor. The Battle of Endor. That being assigned to Darth Vader's flagship was a fast track to potent Teal promotion and command. Given Vader's moods, however, it was also possibly a death sentence. and this in itself indicates a wide problem. How many talented junior officers or gunners or fighter commanders died on the Executor even before Endor, simply because they displeased Vader in some way? How much knowledge and ability were squandered by the Empire on the capricious whims of Palpatine's apprentice? Additionally, while the other Star Destroyers in the assembled fleet had a great deal of combat experience, was this really true of their crews? Given the way the Navy had been purged of those deemed disloyal during the Crimson Dawn affair, how many newly trained officers sat in positions previously held by battle hardened professionals? How many green pilots were flying into battle against the best the rebellion had to offer? How many capable soldiers who would have served either aboard ships or in the army at the field jet deserted in the aftermath of Hoth? The Empire had been eroding its own military from the inside for years. Endor may have been the moment when those weaknesses proved fatal. The Death Star's intervention in the battle, while dramatic, was also indicative of the embrace of firepower without giving due consideration to its targeting. Perhaps Moff Jerjerrod believed that Emperor Palpatine wanted to draw out the destruction, which is why he, having been ordered by Palpatine to fire at will, instructed the super laser to target ships other than Home One. Regardless of its rationale, it made very little military sense. Destroying the rebel flagship would have crippled the enemy's ability to coordinate their forces. Leaving it alone only highlighted the extent to which some in the imperial military, presumably including the emperor himself, believed that raw destruction be enough to quell their opponents without anticipating how the rebels may react to it. Down on the forest moon itself, the gathered stormtroopers and army personnel were all notionally combat veterans who had served for at least 3 or 4 years. But together, they had all missed the dangers posed by the indigenous Ewoks. Why? Could it be that an empire which had drilled into its armed forces and citizens that aliens were inferior, and that in most combat situations enemies should be expected to fear them and flee had stopped learning from the war they were embroiled in? That it was now almost ideologically incapable of understanding its own blind spots? Much time has been spent on wondering why the Empire failed at Endor, when the truth may be that this outcome was the almost natural conclusion to the path the Imperial military had been set upon. That Imperial society had sucked the ingenuity and imagination from its own personnel, to the extent that they were no longer intellectually capable of dealing with an enemy like the Rebel Alliance. There were at least some within the gathered leaders who could recognize what was happening at Endor as events began to unravel. Battle recordings show that Admiral Sloane realized how vulnerable the Executor had suddenly become, and was in the process of moving her vigilance into a supporting position when the Super Star Destroyer's bridge was struck by an A-wing and the enormous vessel sank into the Death Star's gravity well. As the ship exploded onto the battle station's surface, taking many of those best young officers with it, Sloane took command of the fleet and prepared for the retreat. She, at least. Imperial Archives, Section Military Operations, File, Battle of Endor Ground Forces Composition. 18 Imperial Archives Section, Military Operations, File, Battle of Endor to Vigilance Movements. The Battle of Endor. Understood that not only was the battle about to be lost, but that the entire framework of the Empire was about to utterly change. Because within the battle station, Emperor Palpatine, in his arrogance, had set in motion a series of events that would spell his own death. So fixated had he been on his attempts to lure Luke Skywalker to the dark side, he had hamstrung his own military forces and turned his own apprentice against him. As the Death Star exploded into fragments, the Imperial fleet made a desperate escape into hyperspace, Behind them, they left a jubilant and disbelieving rebel alliance. Throughout the night on Endor, a myriad of species and soldiers wildly celebrated the death of the Emperor and the final destruction of the Galactic Empire. As it would transpire, they were wrong on both counts. They were wrong on both.